want to go on to talk more about your sort of this overarching interest you have when it comes to your painting, and that's how it intersects with science and technology and nature. Because most of the time when an artist who paints representationally is drawn to a subject matter, it's usually responding to something they've seen in reality or a reproduction of something from reality. But you've found another way to come up with your subject matter, which you've been exploring for many years now. And it involves using artificial intelligence and specifically machine learning. Can you tell me a bit about it? Because I find it totally fascinating.
Yeah. Initially, I was looking at how animals and non-humans were perceiving the world, especially visually. And I did a collaborative work with a cognitive neuroscientist called Professor Mandyam Srinivasan, and he's especially famous for his work with bees. So he's kind of the one who found out about the way bees communicate through their dance and how they remember their way to particular flowers and back to their hive. A whole lot of amazing things that he's discovered. So he was using that research to create biomimetic robots that would navigate the world autonomously using these simple rules that were derived from the way that bees navigate the world. So from that, I was interested in how computers, in a sense, see the world. It's a different type of vision, and that then led me to how machine learning interprets images and recreates them. So it's a totally different process than humans would use to see an image. But it still creates something that is recognisable back to humans as an image. It's just a new type of image. So I was just interested in that non-human gaze and how we can unpack that. So I'm always fascinated in ways that we can have a broader understanding of the world around us, like different perspectives that we can get on it. And this was a really different perspective. So that's why I started to experiment with it.
In order for you to experiment with that, do you have to have quite a sophisticated understanding of coding and all that sort of thing?
Honestly, that would have helped, but I did not have that. So I initially worked with a physicist based in Belfast who helped me to develop an algorithm, a little kind of pet artificial intelligence. I mean, it was kind of more of an artificial stupidity, really. It was tiny and not very sophisticated. I could run it on my laptop. I mean, it kind of exploded the laptop, but it would run there. But that kind of gave me at least a good understanding of at least how it's functioning. Not necessarily the specifics of the coding, although I have been learning some of that. But at least the theory behind the way that the artificial intelligence is understanding and reproducing the images. It's mathematical and probabilistic functions that are driving it. So if you break it down, like the individual components of what the machine learning is doing are not necessarily that complicated, but what makes it complicated is the scale of it and the way it interconnects. So that's what makes it kind of unpredictable and interesting, and in some ways reminiscent of a human intelligence. So
how would you use that sort of program to create your own art?
So my initial idea was I would get the artificial intelligence to just look at all of the paintings that I've done, and in a sequence, so that it could then just predict what my next painting should be and save me from the hard work of deciding what it was. It was just like, if I could just get someone else to look at my work and tell me what it was, then I'll just paint that. No need for me to worry myself anymore about constantly trying to reinvent or understand or pick apart my own practice. I'd just outsource all of that, and I would just be able to come into the morning, hit print on the computer, and it would just generate the day's work, and I'll just set that up next to my easel and paint. So listen to podcasts and music and spend a happy day colouring in, and that was going to be my life for the next 10 years in my mind.
But wouldn't that be just derivative of what you've done before? Is that not a problem?
I mean, yeah, it is. Well, it's a different way of looking what it is, and yes, of course, that is the problem, and that's actually an interesting aspect of one of the important critiques of artificial intelligence as it's being implemented now. So initially, it'll tell you things you didn't know about your work, and that is really interesting. And what you're doing is exploring, if you like, the latent space between works. So, I've got a painting over here of a satellite, and a painting over here of a monkey. But then with machine learning, you can look at all of the space, in like the visual space between those two paintings, and all of the possible paintings that exist between them, and pick out the interesting ones in there and paint that. Wow. And it's not just between the two paintings; it's between all of them. So it's like this infinite space of possible combinations.
So why wasn't that enough? That plan of just having your work, putting your work in, and bringing another one out.
Well, I'm a dilettante, so so as soon as I was doing that, I thought, oh wow, like what if instead of just looking at my paintings, I added in some pictures of medical robots? What would happen then? And then so I'm hybridizing it with those things. And in my mind, it felt like what I was doing was training this artificial intelligence. That okay, I initially trained it on my painting, so it's got an aesthetic basis. It's coming from a similar background to me aesthetically. But then I can say, well, have a look at these pictures. How would you make one of my paintings on the topic of this? And so then it produces, medical robots is one of them. Or, I've always been like fascinated with Fragonard, for example. So throw in a few Fragonard paintings and see how that comes out. Get a little bit more Fragonard in my paintings.
That's a bit different from a medical robot. A Fragonard painting.
Yes, yeah.
Well, the most famous Fragonard painting that I can think of is The Swing. It's a Rococo style, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the link to me would be that period of the Enlightenment in France. You have the salon culture. So, you would have these intellectual gatherings, and that was actually one of the main vectors for science to be communicated, outside of just the laboratories. And into the broader public. I mean, it was a narrow definition of what the public was, but that was an important place for the propagation and development of science and scientific theory. So, in a way, those Fragonard paintings, are a direct precursor to the medical robots that came later on. We couldn't have had the robots without the Fragonard.
I don't know about direct, but yeah, I can see your point. So really what you're injecting into the program are things that you personally feel a connection to.
Yes, exactly. I started with, there's like a few hundred images of my own paintings. And then I augmented that by, flipping them horizontally and rotating and cropping and things like that. So it kind of expands out to a few thousand. That's the basis. Once it's trained on that many images, it can start to produce something that reasonably resembles an image that that looks vaguely like a painting I might have done. It still requires quite a bit of interpretation to get it back into a painting, but it's enough to get the gist. What the computer is producing often has a lot of sort of glitches or melty type features or like blobs of color appearing in random spots, and often I know what it's reaching for because I'm very familiar with the stuff that's been put in. So I know that blob is really an abstract circle that I put in a particular painting. But it's it does require some work to get back to it.
Well, you've got a show coming up at Sullivan and Strumpf. Everything will probably be fine, and it's a collection of fantastic paintings. A lot of animals, which I noticed, a lot of polar bears, which I should say are not straightforward to polar bears.
Yeah, I've had some fun with the polar bears. I just was doing some generations of images using this machine learning model, and it was producing things that to me were reminiscent of a polar bear, or a polar bear on an ice floe, or the head of a polar bear floating in a corner.
Were you surprised when it popped up at first?
I was happy. Yeah. I was happy. It's like, great. There's an animal that I haven't painted before. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of weird because, well, it's not weird, but it's so symbolic for us of climate change.
Yeah, exactly. And this was the thing, because it, working with these models, it feels sometimes like the artificial intelligence is trying to tell you something. And so, these machine learning models, the big corporate ones in particular, use a horrifying amount of energy to run. So, like the natural language program, so the sort of thing that allows you to say, hello, Google, is like the equivalent of, to run one of those, or develop one, is like the equivalent of 1,000 jumbo jet trips between Europe and the US. Like it's an insane amount of stuff.
God.
And the amount of data that they use to train on is huge. And, the data centers that they're stored in, they're physical buildings. They produce an enormous amount of heat. They take a huge amount of energy. They're ugly. It's a whole shadow city that's out there, of this infrastructure. And of course we're getting into it, but the devices that we use to use machine learning, like the method of constructing them is environmentally damaging. So the elements like the lithium and stuff that come out, there's huge problems with the mining, not to mention the ethics of the labor of it. But this image comes out of the machine learning, and it's like a polar bear, which of course is this, has been this avatar of climate change for decades now. And I think, it's like the artificial intelligence has a guilty conscience about what it's doing.
Yeah.
It doesn't, but that's what it feels like.
Well, that's right. Well, that's sort of that's sort of the artistic expression that seems to sort of be emanating from it in a way. And as an artist, you're grabbing onto that.
That's right. Know? Yeah. And it always feels to me like when you're using machine learning, it's like it's related to me to the way that the dataists and surrealists would work, with automatic writing and tapping into the subconscious. It's another way of approaching things, but it feels like a mathematical subconscious, or maybe even a globally connected, through the internet and the way that those huge databases are gathered, tapping into some unconscious there and using that to fuel it, rather than just my own automatic scribbling. So it feels like accessing some larger reservoir of knowledge than I have access to.